I'm Michael Lachlan, Executive Director of Outreach. We are committed to celebrating the LGBTQ Catholic experience, publishing essays, articles, and resources each week at www.outreach.faith. We're excited to bring you a variety of conversations with LGBTQ Catholics discussing a range of topics important to our community. Greg Krajewski, a gay filmmaker based in Chicago, developed this project for Outreach. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Mike.
Let me start by asking what drove you to work on this interview project?
That's a great question. For years, I worked for a Catholic media production company. And in that time, I had the ability to interview and talk to and work with some amazing Catholics doing amazing work in different ministries and organizations. And there were times that I just really wanted to ask them or know what their opinion was about different LGBTQ and Catholic issues. And I wasn't ever really able to. I was mostly closeted at the time. The people I worked with knew that I was out, but no one else really did. But it was very much a subject that was not discussed. So now that I'm not working in that Catholic media space directly, I feel this freedom to engage with other queer Catholics about these issues, which has been really affirming and positive for me.
Yeah, building that community among LGBTQ Catholics, I think, is so important so we can kind of celebrate together when good things are happening in the church, but also be there for one another when there's challenges. And I know you touch on both the celebrations and the challenges in these conversations, so I'm excited we get to share them. So let's get going. Who are you talking to today?
Today I'm talking to Yunuen Trujillo, who's a Catholic lay minister for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. She's actually the religious formation coordinator, the Spanish religious formation coordinator with the Catholic ministry with lesbian and gay persons. So she's been doing that for years. She's also an immigration attorney, but most kind of interesting to me, she's also the author of a book called LGBT Catholics, A Guide for Inclusive Ministry, which is published by Paulist Press. I really wanted to talk to her about what it's like to work with LGBTQ Catholics and how she got to this point, a little bit about her story as well.
Great. So for anyone listening, you can go to www.outreach.faith, read more about this interview. We'll have a link to the book. While you're there, you can sign up for weekly gospel reflections from Father James Martin, learn about Outreach's conference, and get connected with our resources. Now, the conversation with Greg and Yunuen.
I spent the first 12 years or so of my professional life creating Catholic videos. I had the pleasure of working with a lot of Catholic organizations that are involved in ministry, ministering to young people, ministering to Hispanic populations, ministering to priests, to men, or to engaged people. One of the highlights was a short documentary that I was able to both produce and direct for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of Evangelization and Catechesis. The doc focused on ways to minister to the nuns, those people who, when asked what religious affiliation they belong to, they mark none. Over the course of filming, I was able to interview some leading Catholic thinkers and doers discussing topics of social justice, beauty, new media, science, truth, and parish transformation. When running the interviews, I'd ask the prescribed questions, but the context of the discussion allowed me, a married gay man who was professionally in the closet at the time, to ask a few more questions. Questions I would not have been comfortable asking without the cover of a bishop-sanctioned documentary. The most important question for me was, in essence, what makes someone a Catholic? Both in my personal life and working in Catholic media, I'd been exposed to many people who did not believe I had a place in the church. That my marriage not only excludes me from the Eucharist, but cuts off my connection to God. As Catholics, what do we say to those at the door who might want to enter, or those getting ready to exit because they are, say, pro-choice, or they're gay and married, or they don't believe in one teaching or another? Do we pull them in? Do we push them out? I really wanted to hear the answer from these experts to my question. To a person, I didn't feel like I got a satisfactory answer. Over the years, I've come to my own realization on this. The church doesn't seem to have a solid, concrete answer because everyone is different. Everyone's consciences and faith journeys are so different. Ministry isn't one size fits all, It's personal. It's individual. It's a relationship. Now that I'm fully out, I'm really enjoying the opportunity to be more explicit in my questioning. How is the church called to minister to me, to the LGBTQ community at large? I reached out to Yunuen Trujillo, an immigration attorney by trade who has also spent most of her life working in various ministries in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Most relevant, she serves as the Spanish Religious Formation Coordinator for the Catholic ministry with lesbian and gay persons of the Archdiocese. She's also the author of a book on the subject of ministry to LGBTQ people called LGBT Catholics, A Guide for Inclusive Ministry. I started our conversation by asking her what she felt was the state of LGBTQ Catholic ministry in the U.S.
That is a complicated question because I believe the answer varies depending on what part of the U.S. You live in. However, I would say that there is some opposition to inclusive LGBTQ ministry in the U.S. That tends to come from, you were speaking of Catholic media, right? I was a radio host for 5 years in a very conservative Spanish-speaking Catholic radio station. And so a lot of the opposition that we find comes from spaces where there's loud voices, if you will. But if you ask me, the majority of Catholics in the United States are actually supportive. There's LGBTQ ministries that already exist at a lot of parishes in the U.S. There's some dioceses that have a diocesan or archdiocesan ministry. Here in LA, the archdiocesan ministry has been in existence since 1986. So it's been around for a long time, but it's barely, if you will, coming out of the closet in the sense that now we're trying to make our work a little bit more public. And so I would say there's ministry happening in some areas, whereas, and there's also some areas where there's nothing happening. But there's a hunger and a need for us to have inclusive ministries at every parish.
You had mentioned the struggles that come from areas with loud voices in opposition to the inclusion of LGBTQ people. Where would you say those opposing voices are coming from? Let's assume for a minute that those loud voices are generally of goodwill, that they want to do the will of the church, the will of God. What is their challenge?
Why is it so difficult for them to consider the possibility?
Yes, like what are the sources of their opposition?
So I think it's a twofold answer. Number one, there's a big disconnect between the reality, the lived experience of LGBTQ Catholics, and what those voices or those people think that we do on our daily life, right? And so I think part of it comes from not knowing who we are and allowing a variety of prejudicial ideas to blind their sight and not be able to see beyond what they already assume about us. I think that's one part. And I think the other part is sometimes not having an adequate knowledge of doctrine and believing that doctrine says, we're supposed to do this, and this is how we're supposed to react to anything that comes from the LGBTQ community. So I think it's a little bit of I don't want to use the word ignorance, but a little bit of who we are, and even of some aspects of doctrine that are positive doctrine that are usually not mentioned.
Yeah, in your book, LGBTQ Catholics, A Guide to Inclusive Ministry, which I just loved, and I've bought 2 copies so far. I gave one to my sister. What really struck me about, this whole section in your book where you talk about how to do this ministry, and what really struck me is that the challenges to starting these ministries. There's an extra layer of challenge. There's obviously the base level challenge that any ministry has. I think about For example, what are the challenges in working with the Hispanic population? It's that it's not a monolith. There is such a wide range of what that means, and each community needs something different, and each community is different. So as much as the American church tries to say, well, we need to minister to the Spanish-speaking community, there's second generation. There's people from different countries that have different sensibilities. And so that problem seems to also exist in the LGBTQ space. And then on top of that, there's just the opposition that comes from being identified as LGBTQ in general. What would you say are some ways that we can overcome some of those initial challenges before we even get to the basic ministry challenge?
Right. So I think we need to start. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I used to be a faith-based community organizer. We organized around immigration, other issues that had nothing to do with LGBTQ inclusivity, but we did our organizing in faith spaces, Catholic, Muslim, non-Catholic as well. One of the biggest principles is you have to be able to develop those one-on-one relationships, and you have to be able to share your story with people, so that you can start creating awareness, and they can start getting to know you, right? Because like I said, the biggest issue is this lack of knowing each other. And so to me, just the fact that we're having this conversation today, the fact that we can tell our stories and no longer be invisible, to me, that's a number one step. I know it sounds something very easy, and how is that going to create change? But over time, once you start creating awareness, there's a lot of people. So we were talking about the loud voices, but the truth is the majority of Catholics are somewhere in the middle. And, they're listening to the arguments against LGBTQ ministry, and they're like, well, that makes sense. But then if you share your story and then share the other side, they might say, oh, that makes more sense. And so just being able to have that conversation, to me, is the number one step.
Yeah. Speaking of that conversation or that story, I'm curious if you'd be willing to share some of your story, specifically your background in ministry. What drew you to this ministry work in the first place?
Sure. So something that I usually don't share is that I wasn't really raised Catholic. As someone born and raised in Mexico, I was baptized Catholic, First Communion, everything. But my mom, she was a searcher. So we were raised experiencing other faith traditions. And it wasn't until I came out of the closet at the age of 17 here, and once we had moved to the US, that my mom said, okay, we need to find something for you. And she gave me this flyer to a spiritual retreat that was being organized by young adults. I thought I wasn't going to like it, but I loved the retreat. It was a beautiful retreat. This youth group, the members, they were like Jesus, right? And they always talked about loving Jesus. And so I had this encounter with Jesus. I didn't want to, and I had this community. I didn't want to let go of that community, especially as someone who had just migrated to the US, had no friends. And so I decided to go back into the closet, right? And so for 10 years, I focused on doing ministry work and growing as much as I could spiritually and personally, and going to school. And that's when my entire world became Catholic. So I did young adult ministry for a while, Catholic radio for a while, religious formation for a while, until I came out of the closet again. And so when I came out of the closet the second time, that's when I had this crisis where I said, okay, am I going to stay in the church? Because most LGBTQ people leave the church because they're LGBTQ. I came to the church because I was LGBTQ. And so at this point, I could leave if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. And that's when a couple of Marta and Javier Plasencia, two parents with an LGBTQ son, they said to me, no, you have to stay and do this ministry work with us. So that was in 2014. And that's when I started doing the ministry work with the LA Archdiocese and Ministry. They retired, and so I kind of took over on what they were doing. So that's how I became involved.
I'm really struck by the many different ways LGBTQ Catholics have found their way back to the church. or found their way into the church, or have stayed, whatever the case may be. Each of their stories is so personal, and while there's some themes that might unite some of them, not one is the same as the other. I was born and raised Catholic, and it's because of my family's Catholicism that I'm still Catholic today, even though they're not currently accepting of me and my husband. In college, and even afterwards, I was pretty active in my personal life with the church. I would sing in choir and even act as a youth ministry leader. My family's rejection, which came after college when I started dating my husband, caused my relationship with the church that was once filled with activity and participation to shift to one that was more personal and quiet. It's as if I decided I was going to cut the community aspect of it. I continued to go to church because of the Eucharist. I knew it was important and I wanted to maintain my relationship with God and with the church, but I didn't actively participate as much as I used to because I just didn't want to get into it with anyone. I was fortunate to have a lifeline in some affirming Catholic friends and a particularly good Franciscan friar who guided me through those rough years as my spiritual director. So you had this couple who kind of encouraged you to continue on your journey in the church and in ministry. What has been your experience in that space since then? I think what really interests me especially is how you got involved with the Archdiocese there. Like, that's a pretty high level association that grants you a lot of, I'll say power, for lack of a better word. Like you had some sort of connection to what could be seen as like the highest authority in the area and affirmation of what you're doing there. And so I'm curious how you ended up working with the Archdiocese and working in ministry in a bigger way.
So the connection actually happened before LGBTQ ministry. So when I was in young adult ministry, the director of Pastoral Juvenil, which is young adult ministry in Spanish, he was looking for, this is when he wanted to start a radio show, right? So he was looking for young adults that would participate. And I said, okay, I wanna do it. So yeah, I guess I would say he opened a lot of doors for me. And maybe more than it is, like you said, the word power, I see it more as access. So he did give me access. And then that's how I met the Plasencias, because he was also giving them access in our formation courses to give a course on, well, at the time it was called homosexuality, right? Once they invited me to do this work, they said, you already have those doors open. So why don't you stay in those spaces? That's when I connected with the Archdiocese and ministry, which they were part of. We do have a spiritual director, and we do meet with the Archbishop when necessary, whether it's once a year or less or more, depending on what's happening. But it is volunteer-led. And so I think that, in a way, gives us some freedom, while also being, we're also vetted by the Archdiocese whenever we give talks at the Religious Education Congress and things like that. So that's how that connection happened. It was before.
I was really struck by your book and the way you were able to clearly articulate and understand the wide range of opinion on how LGBTQ people should be approached. Like, it's an extremely pastorally sensitive book.
Oh, thank you.
Do you find yourself having to change different things you want to say, or censor, or just be sensitive to the fact that the person who runs this local church doesn't really want me to dive into this aspect of it? So I'm curious about that self-censoring different messages that you give on different platforms.
Yes, that's definitely a thing. I call it doing prudent ministry, but you could also call it self-censoring. Yeah, it's always been a concern to me, if I'm honest with you, because I have access to the space. I'm also very aware that at any point that access could be closed, and which is why I started doing or trying to do some outreach work online. But so going back to the question of self-censoring, yes, I do. I always want to know, if I'm giving a talk somewhere, who's my audience? How likely are they to be supportive or not supportive? Because the truth is that I'm also vulnerable, right? I'm an LGBTQ person as well. So I'm not going to put myself in harm's way. And so I do try to focus on pastoral care. I try to focus on pastoral sensitivity. And in the book in particular, I think I struggled a little bit because I wanted it to be a book that would give hope to LGBTQ Catholics. But in the doctrine chapter, I wanted it to be a book that was authoritative, right? So when a non-LGBTQ Catholic reads it, they understand what I'm saying is not as an LGBTQ Catholic. What I'm saying is as a religious formation coordinator, right? And this is the doctrine, and these are the documents that I'm quoting. And so if you read the book, you're going to notice there's some sections that sound like they're written for LGBTQ Catholics, and then there's this section that all of a sudden I'm not even identifying as an LGBTQ Catholic anymore. And so I did struggle with that. I talked to my editor, and he said, you know what, leave it that way. It's fine. But yeah, it's because depending on who I'm speaking to, I do change the tone. I do explore. Sometimes I push the boundaries more. But yes, you are right. You noticed it. And yes, it is true. So far, I haven't had any issues of, I don't know, anybody calling me and saying you're saying something that's not church doctrine, because I do stay within church doctrine parameters. But at the same time, I invite people to think about everything that the Holy Spirit is still trying to teach us, and to pay attention to the signs of the times, and to realize that maybe there's more that we need to learn, and we need to expand our doctrine as well.
I'm curious about your experience with this, the different types of ministry, and where do you feel the most progress or the most hope is? Where do you feel the most successes are, or whatever it is? We think about one-on-one ministry with individuals, we think about family, we think about parish, diocesan, national, international organizations. What do you find yourself drawn to, and where do you see hope in all of this?
I think, the first place where I find hope is whenever I see parents involved in the creation of these spaces. I have a friend, I mentioned her story a little bit in the book as well. She was very involved in ministry, and she created an LGBTQ ministry called Agape. One thing that she said to me when she left the church, because she was tired of it and left the church, she said, why do I have to be the one creating these spaces when I'm the vulnerable person? And so to me, there's hope when I see parents and other allies creating these spaces and saying, no, we're going to stand up for our children. We're not going to let this happen, right? Because why should they be creating those spaces for themselves? That, to me, that's the number one place. Obviously, right now, I see a lot of hope with Pope Francis, but I tend to be the kind of person who likes to remind people this isn't happening because of Pope Francis. Yes, he's doing amazing work. There's other areas where he also has to improve, such as on trans issues, but it is the Holy Spirit moving the church in that direction. And so I always have to remind myself of that, especially because even being part of an archdiocesan ministry, as someone doing ministry in Spanish, there's not a lot of people doing it in Spanish. So it's been a very lonely journey. And so sometimes even when I give a talk, I might have an extra chair. This is something that my spiritual director used to do. Let's have an extra chair, and that's where the Holy Spirit sits, right? And so that way I don't feel alone either when I'm giving a talk. And so to me, just focusing on this is happening because the Holy Spirit is trying to show the church how wrong it's been in the way that we've been treated. And so that's where I get my hope from, and from parents. I think that's where there's the most progress. I think there's more openness to listening to the story of parents and to letting parents create these spaces. But I do think that needs to change. I think it shouldn't just be parents that are listened to and that have this type of freedom to address the need of LGBTQ Catholics.
Yeah, definitely. I did an interview recently with Brent, who lives here in Chicago. And what really struck me about him was his practice of Catholicism was so involved a lot of these more pious elements that I wouldn't expect to come from a queer person. Like, I have found in my experience working with all of these Catholic ministries that are more traditional, if someone has the energy and the money to produce content, for example, they're probably more conservative. That's just where the money is in this space. They're probably not going to be pro-LGBTQ. And with that, I experience a lot of these people who are, I'll say, the best and worst of Catholicism in the same person, where they seem to have a very strong sense of like wanting to listen to God, wanting to listen to the Holy Spirit, feeling connected to the church in that way, but then also kind of falling into these traps of tribalism or American conservatism. So I guess in working with LGBTQ people specifically, talk a little bit about the importance of that relationship with God, the relationship with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus. Maybe talk a little bit about that practice of religion and that practice of faith. Like, what parts of Catholicism are you drawn to that really give you hope and really give you a sense of certainty?
Okay, let's see. Where do we start? So I guess I see a divide in the way that we often practice Catholicism, which is you're either the rule follower or you are the seeker, right? And seekers, they're usually taking religious formation course. They're usually trying to learn more, right? I mentioned earlier, right? I have my mom and my sister. My mom's not Catholic. My sister was Catholic for a little bit, practicing Catholic. And then she left because she said, well, Catholicism doesn't give you the tools to have a personal relationship with God. That's how she saw it, right? And so I do think there's some tools like the Jesuit, some Jesuit methods to having that deeper relationship with God. Whereas, the experience that we had was, I don't know, praying the rosary, which didn't feel much like having a relationship with God. And so to me, I'm a rule follower, but more than that, I'm an advocate, and the Holy Spirit is an advocate, right? And the Holy Spirit is a she. We always talk about the Holy Spirit as a she. And so to me, my hope comes from saying, you know what? It's good to have these rules. It's good to have these practices. But what matters the most, like you said right now, is our relationship with God. And we got to have that direct relationship. And we got to allow ourselves to question things. Because if you don't question things, who's the only person that doesn't question anything? Or who are those who, well, actually, let me rephrase that. Children always question everything. We usually tell children not to question, right? They're the ones that, you shouldn't question that. Just do it. But if you're an adult, you have to question things. Otherwise, you're not growing spiritually. And so to me, having a relationship with God means I have to question everything. And I have to be a searcher. And I have to ask God for the gift of discernment to try to figure out that answer. Otherwise, I'm not growing. That's my approach. And that's why to me it's so important to focus on the Holy Spirit, on knowing that not everything is written, right? Not everything is written. There's still stuff that's happening. We're a living church. We're a church of living waters, not of stagnant waters. And so why are we going to be stagnant? So that's one thing. The other thing is there's a lot of fear involved in some parts of our Catholic practice, right? Fear and guilt. That's how, I'll speak as someone from Mexico. That's how indigenous peoples became Catholic, because you were forced to become Catholic. So there was a lot of fear, and you're going to go to hell. The same thing is happening right now in American politics, right? There's a lot of fear. Either you're afraid of immigrants or you're afraid of LGBTQ people. And so to me, God does not want us to be and live in fear, much less to be and live in fear of other siblings. It's kind of like it's our mission to not live in fear and to live in the hope of the Holy Spirit. That's how I see it. But like you said, sometimes politics, money has a lot to do with it, and where the money is and the resources in Catholic media. One thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the LGBTQ ministries that thrive tend to be male and white. And if you ask yourself, why is that? I once had a research meeting with a pastor trying to see if he would be open to having an LGBTQ ministry at his parish. And he said, well, I'm afraid of losing donors. And so, if you have LGBTQ people who are more likely to have better wages and replace those donations, those ministries might be more likely to thrive. So there's a lot of things happening here. And so to me, I'm saying I don't want to feel hopeless. I don't want to feel afraid. And the only way I can do that is by trusting that the Holy Spirit is driving this. It's not me. It's not anybody else.
Going into that idea of intersectionality a bit more, Father Brian Massingale, he spoke on intersectionality in these spaces and how important it is to view this as one thing, because he said, because our opposition puts them all together. Like, they don't differentiate between the gay person, the immigrant. Like, they're seeing this all as one big problem. And why are we segmenting it so much? It's all related, which I found really insightful. But I'm curious about the opposite of that. There are a lot of LGBTQ organizations. You talk about the most successful ones are run by white men, but I've also found really successful ones tend also to dip into multiple intersectional things. One example that I'll bring up, not as a positive or negative, but just as a reality, like Dignity USA, they're not just about LGBTQ, they're also about the role of women and, for example, women priests. And so to associate with Dignity would mean tacit approval of that as well. Intersectionality, these are all related on some level. But I'm curious about your thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of expanding what we're trying to do as queer people in the church, and is there a difference between the advocacy and this lived reality?
Somebody just asked me this question recently. I'm part of somehow I became involved in a lot of different ministries, at least 3 different spaces that are about women's inclusion in the church. And so in one of these ministries that I'm part of, somebody asked the same question. Do we dilute the message of, female inclusivity by speaking about LGBTQ issues in this space, right? And so do we dilute the message by talking about other issues in LGBTQ spaces? I don't think we do. One thing that I've learned as a community organizer is that everything is interrelated. Just like Father Brian Massingale said, right? Every injustice that immigrants are a victim of, it is usually, it is the same people doing that injustice that is the people that are trying to do this other injustice towards LGBTQ Catholics. So I do think we need to be more intersectional. I always mention back in 2019, I believe, Congress was trying to pass the Equality Act, which would benefit LGBTQ people. And the USCCB, they were opposing the Equality Act. And they had an FAQ. And question number 3 of the FAQ, it said, who would this act benefit? And so it basically said, well, this benefit would give protections to people who don't need protections because LGBTQ people already have a lot of protections in the US. They make more money than heterosexual people in a lot of industries. And I was like, what do you mean they make more? Like, who are you talking about? And so I looked at the documents they were quoting, and they were studies of, I don't know, the corporate world and, gay men in the corporate world. And so I said, no, again, you're looking at white men. And I understand a lot of our ministries are there's a lot of white males, but there's more to us than that. I'm a Latina. I'm, an immigrant, and I'm also LGBTQ. I had a client, a trans client from Guatemala, right? So we're pro-immigrant, but then we're not going to be pro-immigrant if the immigrants are trans. And then when you mention the women and women inclusivity in the church, I don't think people realize how related these 2 topics are, because if you think about it, so this is why I think the church is having such a difficult with trans issues. If you become more welcoming of trans Catholics, what's going to happen if an LGBTQ priest comes out as a trans Catholic and wants to transition? Can they still be a priest? No, because women cannot be, they're not allowed in the priesthood. Oh, wait, so now it's a women's issue. And so in my opinion, they're heavily interrelated. And I do think we need to be more intersectional for us to be more successful in inclusivity.
Do you think the intersectionality then works in the other direction where, say, for example, I personally would not want to be a part of Courage, the international organization supported by the church as a whole, because I don't agree with a lot of their stances. And obviously I'm married to a man and they wouldn't agree with that. But there are places where we could find common ground and agree and work towards something. Do you think that intersectionality can work in the other direction? Are there Catholic organizations out there that are big and well known that could find themselves working with queer Catholics in spaces where we agree?
So the problem here, I think, is for intersectionality to work, there has to be a balance of power. What I think the problem is here is that these organizations like Courage, they tend to have more power within the Catholic Church. And because it is the status quo, there's this, I don't know, I think there's less willingness to perhaps agree to collaborate, but also less willingness to even acknowledge that an inclusive space could also be a good thing, right? Because I respect, so one of the things that I try to do, even in the book, I try to create awareness as to the fact that, listen, there's some LGBTQ Catholics whose vocation is to be single and abstinent, and that's okay. That's okay. So I think it's okay for us to mention that and say, that's okay, and be more welcoming. There's LGBTQ Catholics who don't like to identify as gay or LGBTQ. They might say they're same-sex attracted. That's okay. That's their journey. That's where they're at. That's their vocation. And so it's more about, what about those of us that are excluded from the church regularly because we're not single and abstinent, because our vocation is to be with someone for a lifetime. So to me, there's an imbalance of power. And while it is important to acknowledge that, yes, there's LGBTQ Catholics in the spaces, and this is who they are in their vocation, and hopefully we can collaborate, I don't know if we would be able to collaborate while there's that imbalance of power.
It's been almost 2 years since I was working full-time for the church, and I'd be lying if I said I'd never missed any of it. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad I'm not there anymore. The distance has allowed me the room to get to know myself better and explore my relationship with the church and with God for the better, I hope. But I do miss being able to use my gifts for the church in that direct way. Part of me knows that I would no longer be welcomed by many of the people who used to think so highly of me and my work. I now have this public persona that is out, and associating with people who are out is a risky move for Catholic organizations that are meant to uphold Catholic values. Can you imagine the bishops hiring an out married gay man to represent them in any public capacity? Or the uproar that would arise if parents knew their kids were interacting with a gay married man during a youth conference? The last kind of direct question I had was about this idea of change versus development when it comes to Catholic teaching, like sexual ethics. And I know there's some organizations, some LGBTQ Catholics who are like, we need to burn it all down. Like everything needs to change. I think the word change is the word that I find problematic because the Catholic Church doesn't change, it develops.
Right. And over centuries.
Over centuries, which is,
right.
Again, part of the reason I love being Catholic is that slow moving. It's not the right-wing Americans' church. It doesn't belong to them. It doesn't belong to the left. It's its own thing, and it moves at a snail's pace over generations, which is great and frustrating. So where do you see the church needing to develop its teachings? Where do you see the church moving?
Wow, I feel like this is the last question, but I might spend 20 minutes on this one now. Maybe not 20 minutes, but so I had a webinar sponsored by the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. And the reason why I mentioned this is because I did spend 20 minutes on talking about some stuff that I think, well, talking about doctrine and then highlighting the good parts that already exist and then the things that I think need to improve. But when we talk about burning it all down, so I think part of the problem is that for LGBTQ Catholics, we think that all that is there is bad, right? Because what we hear is misconceptions of doctrine. Like this concept that when you hear, oh, you have to be celibate. Celibacy is not even the doctrine that applies to us. It's chastity. And chastity applies to everyone, not just to LGBTQ Catholics. It also applies to heterosexual people, etc. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a better understanding for everyone, not just LGBTQ Catholics, also for those that point fingers at us. There are two areas that I do need improvement. The first one is the understanding of LGBTQ relationships, same-sex relationships. And so, chastity is defined as the integration of sexuality within the person. It doesn't always equal abstinence. It's about, are you integrating the act with your entire being, with your emotions, with your plans for the future? And so to me, as someone who is called to be with someone for a lifetime, as someone who almost married a guy, very handsome guy, when I thought about this, I thought, if I married this guy, if we're a couple and we have sex, I'm not going to be integrating the act with my entire being, because I don't even love him. I don't have that spouse-like emotional connection with him. And so, as an LGBTQ Catholic, I can tell you, I can develop that spouse-like emotional connection with someone of the same sex and integrate the act with my entire being, even though the church says that somehow that's not possible. So I think the church has to start listening to lived experiences. And by church, I mean both the people on the ground and those that are developing the doctrine, and to understand that, hey, perhaps there's something that you missed here. Perhaps, your understanding of what, and here's the other, we're kind of skipping to the second section that I think needs to change. Your understanding of what a sexual orientation is wrong. So in a lot of our documents, we're still using the word homosexuality. It did not exist when the books of the Bible were written, right? That word is a recent word. It was coined in the 19th century. It was barely used in biblical translations in 1946. And when it was coined, it encompassed all same-sex activity, regardless of whether it was consensual, whether it was between two adults, whether it involved violence. So the church is still understanding homosexuality as this, it's conflating it with all kinds of other things like sexual perversion and pedophilia. And so even in the spaces where we say, okay, no, we know that homosexuality, quote unquote, is something different than pedophilia. Even in those spaces, the fact that this is the word that's still being used is problematic to me, because it erases entire groups of people. What about bisexual people? What about asexual people? So there's no clear understanding, number one. Number two, there's this obsessive focus on sex. I'm sorry, but my sexual orientation, I've experienced it as an emotional orientation, an emotional connection, right? And so even this focus on sex, to me, it's kind of offensive. Like, I'm not inviting you to look into that part of my life, right? And then the other part that needs to be developed, because it's heavily underdeveloped, is the understanding of gender identity and gender as a whole. Like, do you even understand what that is? I don't think there's a clear understanding of what it is. And even, somebody came up to me and said, well, trans people have to be celibate. Because again, this is the misconception, right? That the teaching is celibacy. And I say, and what they mean is to abstain, to be abstinent. And so it's like, wait a second, what about trans people who are heterosexual? Because not all trans people are, homosexual, quote unquote. Just the fact that there isn't this an understanding, is like, it's so underdeveloped. Those are the two sections that I think need to improve, because we can't have an honest conversation if one side of the dialogue doesn't even understand the basics of what it means to be an LGBTQ person.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. And I really appreciate your insight into all of this, because just that the pastoral approach is just so important. I'm personally someone who's always reading and researching and figuring out, and I want the answer and I want something that sounds right. But ultimately that lived experience of people, we're called to listen. We're called to be this listening church. And I just appreciate your approach to all of this.
Thank you.
I'm really appreciative of people like Yunuen who are doing the work on the ground, the work of ministering to the LGBTQ Catholic community. It's because of people like her that the people of God are starting to listen and to pay attention and to slowly change. Now, as we wrap up, I have Yunuen's recommendations for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So for sure, they should check out the outreach guide to the Bible and homosexuality, which is online. You can look it up. There's also a documentary. It's kind of a new documentary. It's called 1946, and it's about the introduction of the word homosexuality in the Bible. There's a book called What the Bible Really Says About Homosexuality by Father Daniel Helminick. So that one as well. Those are some that come to mind.
This interview was written, produced, and edited by Greg Krajewski, who also composed the music. Special thanks to Maxwell Kuzma. If you like this interview, consider supporting Outreach so that we can bring you more content like this. Visit our website, outreach.faith, to donate today. Thank you.